I drove up into the mountains late that afternoon, the back of my truck loaded with a few supplies I thought I would need for the next several days. The cabin I had rented sat in a quiet wooded area, far from the nearest small town. The idea was to spend a few nights alone, away from everything. I had been stressed from work, worn down from the noise of daily life, and I thought some isolation in the woods would help clear my head. The road turned rough as I went deeper into the trees, the gravel crunching under my tires. My phone had already lost signal miles back. I kept driving until the trees seemed to fold over the road, closing me in. The cabin finally appeared after a bend, small and simple, made of old wood with a short porch and a tin roof. It looked more weathered than I expected, but it had charm. A stack of chopped logs sat by the steps, though they looked damp from rain. I parked and carried my bags inside. The cabin smelled of dust and old pine. It had one main room with a small table, a wood stove, and a bed against the far wall. There was a kitchen counter with a sink, but no running water. A pump stood outside near the side of the cabin. The windows were small and let in only a dim light through the thick trees. I set my things down, checked the cupboards, and found only a few rusted pans and a coffee tin left behind by whoever stayed there before me. It was simple, just as I wanted. I liked the silence. For a while I sat on the porch and watched the trees sway. The air was cooler than in the valley. The forest seemed alive with small sounds. The rustle of leaves, the faraway snap of branches. As the sun began to sink, I gathered some wood for the stove. The logs outside were damp, so I walked deeper into the trees and collected fallen branches. I made a small fire inside, cooked a simple meal, and sat at the table in the dim light of a lantern. Everything seemed fine until the quiet started to feel too deep. The longer I sat there, the more I realized how far I was from anyone. There were no distant cars, no planes overhead, no human sounds at all, just the steady ticking of the stove and the occasional creak of the wood as the cabin settled. When darkness fell, it felt heavier than I expected. The windows turned into black squares. The lantern flickered and cast shadows that shifted across the rough walls. I kept listening without meaning to, straining for any noise outside. At one point I thought I heard something move beyond the porch. It was faint, like a step or the crunch of leaves. I held still, waiting, but it faded quickly. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon. Still, when I lay in bed that night, I could not shake the feeling of being watched. The woods pressed against the cabin in a way that made me feel small. I finally drifted off, though it was a light sleep. I woke in the night to a sharp sound. At first I thought it was part of a dream, but then I heard it again, wood snapping somewhere outside. I sat up, my heart hammering, and listened. The fire had died down to embers, so the cabin was mostly dark. I could hear faint movement in the leaves, slow, deliberate. Then silence. I stayed awake for hours, waiting for another sound, but nothing came. By morning, the forest looked harmless again. Sunlight filtered through the branches. I stepped outside and checked around the cabin. The ground was soft from rain, and I noticed impressions in the dirt near the porch. At first, I thought they were animal tracks, but they looked more like the flattened marks of boots. They led toward the trees but disappeared quickly in the brush. I told myself hunters sometimes passed through. It was public land after all. Still, the sight of the tracks unsettled me. I pushed it out of my mind, spent the day walking the area, and tried to enjoy the solitude. As the second night came, the unease returned stronger. After cooking, I sat by the window and kept glancing outside, convinced I saw movement. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift, as if someone was standing just beyond the edge of sight. I reminded myself that isolation can play tricks on the mind. That night, just past midnight, I heard it again. Leaves crunching, heavier this time. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, holding my breath. Then came the sound of wood bending, almost like weight pressing against the porch boards. My chest tightened. Someone was out there. The sound lasted only a moment, then stopped. I stayed awake until dawn again, not daring to move. The next morning I checked the porch. The boards had fresh scuff marks, like something had dragged across them. My skin prickled as I looked closer. They weren't claw marks or anything like that. They looked like the tread of shoes scraping against the wood. That day I considered packing up and leaving, but something held me back. Part of me thought I was letting paranoia control me, that I had come here for peace and was now running at the first sign of unease. I convinced myself to stay at least one more night. I tried to keep busy, chopping small branches, cleaning the cabin, and walking down to a stream I found about half a mile away. Still, every time the trees moved, I felt eyes on me. I hurried back to the cabin before the light faded. That evening, I double-checked the door, sliding the old bolt shut. The windows had no locks, but they were small. I stacked some of my bags under the front window just in case. I left the lantern burning longer, not wanting to sit in the dark. Around midnight, it began again. The faint steps, the shift of weight on the porch. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The boards groaned softly, then a scrape, slow and deliberate, right near the door. My pulse pounded so hard I felt dizzy. I waited for the knock that never came. Instead, after a long silence, I heard retreating steps fading into the woods. At dawn, I checked again. More prints. Clearer this time. They were boots, without a doubt. Someone had been walking right up to the door in the night, standing there, then leaving. I had enough. I began to pack. But before I could load the truck, I noticed something farther off near the tree line. A small shape almost hidden. An old tent half collapsed with a fire pit nearby. I walked closer carefully. The tent was shredded and weathered, like it had been there for months. Inside, I found scraps of clothing, torn and filthy, and a single boot that matched the prints near my cabin. The sight made my stomach twist. Whoever had stayed in that tent might still be around. Maybe they were the one walking up to the cabin each night. I went back quickly, packed everything, and decided to leave right then. But when I turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered and refused to catch. I tried again and again, but the truck wouldn't start. Panic rose in my throat. It had been fine the day before. With no phone signal and no working truck, I was stuck. The only option was to wait until morning and hike the long road back toward town. That last night was the longest of my life. I barely kept the lantern burning, watching the door, every sound outside magnified in my head. Around 2 a.m, the steps came again, but heavier, slower. The boards of the porch groaned as if under weight that lingered. I heard the soft drag of something scraping against the door. Then silence. I stayed awake until the first gray light crept through the trees. When I finally opened the door, I found the handle smeared with dirt, as though someone had gripped it during the night. I didn't wait. I slung my pack over my shoulder and left the cabin behind, walking as fast as I could down the long road. Every so often I glanced back, half expecting to see someone following. But the road stayed empty. Hours later, blistered and exhausted, I finally reached a ranger station. I explained where I had been staying and what I had seen. The ranger's face grew serious. He said they had found an abandoned camp in those woods before, signs of someone living rough for months, maybe years, but they had never located the person. I realized then that whoever had been out there was likely still wandering those woods, watching cabins like mine, maybe even waiting for people who came alone. I never went back for my truck. The ranger arranged to have it towed later, but I did not return. The thought of stepping foot near that cabin again made my chest tighten. Even now, I can still picture those footprints on the porch, clear as day. Someone had walked right up to where I lay inside, night after night, just standing there, listening to me breathe through the walls. And the worst part is knowing that whoever it was is probably still out there, waiting for the next person who comes alone. I had been driving for hours before I reached the dirt road that led to the cabin. The air was cool, heavy with pine, and the road stretched narrow between tall trees that seemed to press closer the deeper I went. The cabin wasn't mine, but it belonged to a friend of a friend who said it was empty for months and that I could stay for a while if I wanted quiet. I had been needing quiet. My life had felt crowded and heavy. I thought a few days in the woods, away from people, away from traffic, away from city noise, would give me space to clear my head. The cabin stood at the end of the road, small, with a porch that sagged on one side and dark windows that looked almost black in the late afternoon light. It was the kind of place you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it, hidden between trees and shadow. There was no sound except the wind pushing through the pines and the ticking of my cooling car engine. I got out carrying a small bag and climbed the 3 wooden steps up to the door. The steps groaned under my weight. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood, dust, and faint mildew. The floor creaked as I walked. There was one main room with a couch, a table, and a fireplace full of cold ash. To the side, a small kitchen with a sink and a gas stove that looked decades old. A short hallway led to a bedroom with a single bed, the mattress low and uneven. There was also a narrow bathroom with a cracked mirror above the sink. The whole place felt abandoned, not ruined, but worn and tired, as if time had stretched too long inside it. I unpacked, set my bag on the bed, and opened a window. Cool air drifted in, and I listened to the woods. It was peaceful, more silent than anywhere I had been in years. No cars, no voices, just the endless rustle of trees. I sat outside on the porch until the sun slid down, watching the sky turn from pale orange to deep gray. When darkness fell, it came heavy and complete. Out there, with no streetlights, no houses nearby, the forest swallowed everything. The only light came from the thin glow of the moon and the beam of my flashlight when I moved. That first night I slept lightly. Every creak of the cabin, every brush of the wind outside woke me. The woods were full of noises I wasn't used to. The cry of something far away, the shifting branches, the hollow snap of twigs. Once, late in the night, I thought I heard footsteps outside, slow and heavy in the dirt near the porch. But when I held my breath and listened, the sound faded, and I told myself it had been an animal. Morning brought calm again. Sunlight came in through the dirty window, and the woods looked harmless. I made coffee on the stove and sat with the cup in my hands, breathing the steam, listening to the small sounds of the cabin settling. I walked the area around the cabin, found a narrow trail behind it, and followed it for some distance through the trees. The air smelled sharp and clean. At times I felt watched, though I saw nothing. The trail curved downhill, and at the bottom, I found the remains of an old fire pit with rocks blackened by char. There were broken beer bottles scattered around and a rusted chair frame. The place looked like people had been here years ago but had stopped coming. When I went back to the cabin, I noticed something I hadn't before. Near the edge of the porch, half covered in dirt, there was a shoe print. It wasn't mine. The sole was wider and deeper, pressed down hard into the ground. I crouched to look at it. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either. A couple of days at most. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at it, before brushing it off as a hunter, maybe a hiker, someone passing through. But still, I kept looking over my shoulder that day, listening harder than before. At night, the woods felt different. The silence no longer seemed calm, but tense, stretched tight like something waiting. I lit a small fire in the fireplace to push back the shadows. As I lay on the bed, I heard what I thought was movement again outside. Slow, dragging, then stopping. My heart pounded hard against the mattress. I told myself it was a deer, maybe a raccoon, but the sound was heavy. Too heavy. I got up quietly and moved to the window, pressing my face near the glass. The yard was black, the porch barely visible in the thin moonlight. I stared until my eyes hurt, but I saw nothing. When I finally lay down again, I didn't sleep. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. The ground was soft in places, and I found more prints. They circled around the back near the trail, then cut into the woods. Some of them overlapped, like someone had been pacing or standing in one place. They were boot prints larger than mine, pressed deep. Whoever made them had been close enough to see me if I had stepped outside the night before. My skin crawled, but I kept telling myself it didn't matter. Hunters, maybe. Someone curious. The woods weren't mine alone. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. The third night was worse. I lay on the bed in the dark, listening, my body tight. Hours passed in silence, then I heard it again. Steps on the porch. The boards creaked slowly, one after another, as if someone was testing their weight. I sat up, heart slamming. The sound paused, then started again. My mouth went dry. I reached for the flashlight beside me and switched it on, the beam cutting through the dark. The steps stopped. Silence pressed in. I waited, holding the light steady, but nothing moved. After minutes that felt endless, I turned it off again. I didn't sleep at all. In the morning, I checked the porch. The dirt at the base of the steps had been disturbed. A fresh print sunk into the soil. Whoever it was had been standing just below the door. They had been there, watching, maybe listening, I felt exposed, unsafe, but I stayed. Something in me wanted to know, wanted to see who it was. I told myself I wouldn't be scared away so easily. That day I tried to distract myself. I walked farther down the trail, explored deeper into the woods. The trees grew dense, the ground uneven, and the deeper I went, the quieter it got, like the forest itself was holding its breath. At one point I found a tree with a deep cut in the bark, wide and jagged as if someone had hacked it with a blade. A few steps farther I found another, and then another, forming a rough path through the woods. My stomach sank. Someone had been marking their way, leaving signs. I didn't follow them long. I turned back, my skin crawling, every sound behind me sharp and close. That night I locked the door, though the lock was old and thin. I pushed a chair against it. I sat awake, flashlight in hand, listening. The steps came again not long after midnight. Slow, steady, circling the cabin. They moved from one wall to another, pausing, starting again. At one point, the handle of the door rattled just once, light but deliberate. My chest tightened and I gripped the light harder. I didn't turn it on. I sat in the dark, waiting until the sounds moved away. When dawn finally came, I packed my bag. I told myself I'd had enough, that it wasn't worth it. I loaded my car, but when I tried to start it, the engine coughed and died. I tried again and again, but it wouldn't catch. I checked the hood, though I knew little about engines. Something had been pulled, wires loose where they shouldn't be. My stomach turned cold. Someone had been under the hood, had made sure I couldn't leave. I stood there in the morning light, the forest pressing around me, my car useless. I felt trapped. The cabin no longer looked like a place of quiet. It looked like a cage. I had no cell service, no neighbors, no way out except on foot, miles of forest between me and the nearest road. That night I didn't light a fire. I sat in the dark, silent, waiting. The steps came sooner, heavier. They circled, then paused near the window. I didn't move. I hardly breathed. The faint outline of a face appeared in the glass, just long enough to see before it vanished. My whole body froze. I knew then that whoever it was wasn't just curious. They were waiting, watching, deciding. The hours dragged, but the door never opened. By morning I was hollow from fear, but I knew I couldn't stay. I packed water and food into a backpack and left the cabin, moving fast down the trail. The forest swallowed me, the air thick and close. I kept turning, thinking I saw movement between the trees, but every time I looked, there was nothing. Still, I felt followed, the hairs on my neck stiff. The trail stretched on, twisting, breaking into smaller paths. I kept moving, faster, not caring if I made noise. Hours passed, my legs aching, my throat dry. At one point I found another shoe print in the mud. Fresh, larger than mine, pointing the same way I was going. My chest tightened. I wasn't alone on the trail. When I finally saw the road through the trees, I nearly collapsed with relief. I stumbled onto the asphalt, the late sun glaring down. I walked until I heard the sound of a car, and when it came around the bend, I waved hard, desperate. The driver slowed, staring at me, then let me climb in. I didn't explain much. I just asked to be taken to town. I never went back for the car. I never went back to the cabin. For weeks I woke in the night thinking I heard footsteps outside my window. Sometimes I still dream of that face in the glass, pale and silent, watching. The cabin had seemed empty when I first arrived, but it wasn't. Someone had been there all along, moving through the woods, circling in the dark, waiting for me to notice. I had been wanting to take a break from everything for weeks, and when the chance came up to spend some time alone in a small cabin tucked away in the woods, I took it without thinking too hard. I told myself it would be a reset, a way to get some quiet, maybe even clear my head. The cabin wasn't fancy, more like a shack that had been fixed up enough to make it livable. It sat by itself, a couple of miles down a dirt track that broke off from a forgotten county road. The place didn't have neighbors close by, just dense forest all around, tall pines and thick brush, and the air had that heavy stillness that comes when you're far from anyone else. When I first pulled up, it felt almost too perfect. The cabin was old but solid, with a small porch out front and a single window looking toward the trees. The inside was simple: Wood floors, a table, a small bed, and a narrow counter with a 2-burner stove. No power lines ran out here. The stove used small propane canisters, and the only light came from lanterns. There was no phone signal once I got deep enough into the woods, and that was part of the appeal. I told myself that was what I wanted. No screens, no noise, just time to myself. That first night was calm. I unpacked a few supplies I had brought. Cans of food, some bottled water, a knife, a small hatchet, a blanket. I had this sense of excitement, like I was about to do something that mattered even if it was just sitting by myself in the dark. I built a small fire in the pit out front, cooked a little food, and sat watching the flames as the forest closed in. The quiet wasn't empty, though. Every so often I would hear rustling in the trees, an animal breaking through brush, or the far-off call of something I couldn't name. It wasn't frightening. Just a reminder that I wasn't alone out there, not really. The second night felt different. I had spent the day walking trails, wandering further from the cabin than I planned. The woods all looked the same, endless lines of trees with no landmarks. I marked a few with broken branches just to make sure I'd find my way back. And when I finally got to the cabin again, it was almost dark. I was more tired than I thought I'd be. My legs ached and I didn't feel like building a fire. So I heated a can of soup inside and ate at the table. The lantern's light filled the small space with a warm glow, but it felt small against how large the woods outside seemed. When I finally lay down, I noticed it, the sound of something moving outside. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or raccoon nosing around, but the sound wasn't right. It wasn't quick or frantic like an animal. It was slow, heavy. Something stepping carefully, too carefully, through the brush. I lay completely still, every nerve awake, listening. The sound circled around the cabin, moving from one side to the other, pausing as if whoever or whatever it was didn't want to be heard. I told myself it was just my imagination, that maybe it was a bear or something passing through. But then I heard the unmistakable sound of a foot pressing down on the wooden step of the porch. My chest tightened. I reached for the knife on the table without making a sound. I didn't breathe. I just listened. The weight shifted once on the porch, then again. It stopped just outside the door. No knock, no voice. Just silence, heavy and deliberate. Minutes dragged on, my ears straining. Finally, after what felt like forever, I heard the step creak again as the weight shifted back, slow footsteps fading into the woods. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with the lantern burning low, knife in hand, watching the door until the first light of morning broke through the trees. When the sun came up, it felt stupid. I opened the door, stepped outside, and looked around. The ground was covered in pine needles, broken branches, and dirt, so tracks weren't easy to see. Still, just at the edge of the porch, I noticed the faint shape of a boot print pressed into the soil. Not a paw, not a hoof, a boot. I kept telling myself maybe it was a hunter, someone passing through the woods. Maybe they saw the cabin and were just curious. I held on to that thought all morning as I walked around outside. But I couldn't shake the way those footsteps had circled, the way they had paused at the door without knocking. That night, I made sure to lock the door, even though the old latch didn't seem like much of a defense. I stacked a chair against it too, just to feel like I had something between me and whoever was out there. I lit the lantern but turned it low, afraid of drawing attention. I sat on the bed with my back to the wall, knife in hand again, waiting. Hours passed and I started to think maybe it was over. Maybe the person had just been passing through. Then sometime deep into the night I heard it again. Not footsteps this time, but a scratching sound along the wall. Slow, steady, dragging across the wood. My skin went cold. The sound moved around the cabin, circling. At one point, it stopped under the window. I didn't dare move, but my eyes were fixed on the thin curtain. A shadow shifted across it, the shape of a head, someone standing just inches away from the glass. I froze, hardly breathing. The shadow stayed there for long minutes, then moved on. I heard the faint crunch of steps again, fading into the woods, swallowed by silence. Morning light didn't bring comfort anymore. I knew what I had heard. I knew someone was out there and they weren't just wandering by. They were watching. The next day I thought about leaving, but the dirt track was long and my car was the only way out. If someone had been around, they would know that. The thought of walking that road alone, miles with nothing but trees around me, made my skin crawl. I decided to wait it out, maybe one more night, then I'd leave in daylight. That night was worse. I didn't bother with the lantern. I sat in the dark, the knife in my lap, listening. Hours went by in silence, and then came the sound again. Footsteps, closer this time, not careful anymore. Direct. They came straight to the porch, heavy on the steps. The door handle rattled. I held my breath, heart slamming in my chest. The chair against the door shook as weight pressed against it. The old wood groaned, then silence. Minutes passed, every second longer than the last. My hand ached from gripping the knife so hard. Then I heard something new. The sound of metal tapping softly against the glass of the window. Once, twice, 3 times. Like someone testing the strength of it. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The tapping stopped, and after a long, unbearable wait, the footsteps moved away again. When morning came, I packed my bag in a rush. I wasn't staying another night. I grabbed everything I could carry, shoved it in the car, and started down the dirt road. My hands shook on the wheel, eyes scanning the trees. Every shape looked like a figure standing there watching. A mile or so down, I saw it. In the dirt at the edge of the road, clear as day, was a boot print, fresh, pointed toward the cabin, and beside it another print. Then another. The tracks followed the road behind me like someone had been walking it in the night, heading the same direction I would take to leave. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I drove until the road met pavement, then until I was back in town, the cabin shrinking from memory, but the fear still clinging to me. For days afterward, I kept thinking about the prints, about the way they circled the cabin, the way the door handle rattled, the tapping on the glass. Whoever was out there hadn't wanted food, hadn't wanted help. They had wanted me. They had wanted me afraid, trapped inside that little cabin. And if I had stayed just one more night, I'm not sure the old door would have kept them out. I never went back, but sometimes at night when the world is quiet, I swear I hear it again, that slow, heavy step circling, waiting. Like whoever it was never stopped walking, never stopped following. Always just outside the light, just at the edge of the glass. I had rented the cabin without thinking too much about it. I wanted somewhere quiet, far from the noise of the city, where I could spend a few days in silence and get away from everything. The listing made it look simple but good enough. A small wooden place in the woods, about a half-hour drive from the nearest road, surrounded by trees with a creek nearby. I told myself it would be peaceful. Just a few days with no work, no phone calls, no distractions. The drive itself was already more unsettling than I expected. The dirt road leading to the cabin stretched on for miles, narrowing as it twisted between tall pines. The GPS lost its signal halfway, and I had to rely on printed directions I had written down. By the time I reached the small clearing where the cabin stood, the sun was already dipping low, turning the sky orange. I stepped out of the car and felt the quiet hit me all at once. There were no distant sounds of traffic, no voices, not even the hum of power lines. Just wind moving through branches and the occasional crack of something shifting deep in the woods. The cabin itself looked older than the pictures had shown. The wood was dark, the edges weathered, and the front steps sagged slightly under my weight. Inside, it smelled faintly of dampness and old smoke. There was a single room with a bed pushed against one wall. A small kitchen area with a propane stove and a wood-burning stove for heat. No electricity, just a lantern and some candles left behind. At first, the silence felt almost comforting. I unpacked slowly, stacking my food supplies on the counter and rolling out my sleeping bag on the bed just in case the mattress was worse than it looked. I lit a candle as the sun sank and sat for a while just listening. I thought maybe I'd read a book, maybe walk to the creek in the morning, maybe even try to fish. That first night passed quietly, though I didn't sleep much. Every sound outside seemed magnified. Branches creaking in the wind, small animals rustling through leaves, the distant call of some bird. Lying in the dark, I realized how unused I was to being this far from people. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that it was only nature doing what it always did. Still, I woke up several times, straining to hear, convinced that something had moved too close to the cabin. The next day, I went to explore. The trees pressed in thickly on all sides, making it hard to see far. The creek was only a short walk away, and I followed it upstream for a while before circling back. I noticed things then that stuck in my head later. A cigarette butt half buried in the dirt near the water, an empty beer can wedged between some rocks. Little signs that someone else had been around, though I hadn't seen a soul since I arrived. Back at the cabin, I tried to relax. I cooked some food, wrote in a notebook, sat on the porch and listened to the wind. But as the day wore on, I started to notice details I couldn't ignore. The faint scuff marks on the doorframe, as if someone had scraped it with a knife or tool. A nail half pried out of the back window frame. I told myself it could have been from years of weather, animals, or just wear and tear, but it didn't feel right. That second night, things changed. I was lying in bed with the lantern blown out, staring at the ceiling when I heard it. A deliberate sound. Not the random scuffle of an animal, but something heavy pressing down on the front steps, wood bending slightly under weight. I froze, every muscle tight, barely breathing. Then nothing. Just silence again. I stayed awake until morning, clutching the flashlight in my hand. When the first light came, I went outside to check. At first I saw nothing. Then, near the edge of the clearing, I noticed footprints in the damp dirt. Not boots like mine, but lighter, flatter prints like worn sneakers. They circled part of the cabin, stopping at the back window where that nail had been pulled out. My stomach sank. Someone had been there, moving around while I lay inside, listening. I thought about leaving that morning, but stubbornness held me back. I told myself it was probably just some drifter, maybe someone hunting or fishing nearby, curious about the cabin. If I packed up and left right away, it would feel like running, like admitting fear. So I stayed, though unease settled deeper into me. That day dragged on slowly. Every sound outside made me tense. I barely left the porch, afraid of what I might see deeper in the trees. I checked the car twice to make sure it still started. By evening, I decided I'd sleep lightly again and leave at first light the next day. But that night was worse. I tried to lie still, but the sounds returned. First the crunch of leaves, faint but steady, then the same weight on the front steps. This time I heard the slow creak of wood under careful movement. My chest tightened as if it were caving in. Then I heard the sound that made my skin crawl more than anything. The door handle shifting. Slow pressure, as if someone was testing how quietly they could turn it. I sat up, heart pounding, and grabbed the flashlight. I didn't make a sound, just waited, staring at the door. After what felt like forever, the handle stopped moving. Then silence. No footsteps leaving, no sound at all. Just nothing. I couldn't take it anymore. At first light, I shoved everything into my bag and went outside to the car. But when I got there, I stopped cold. Both of my tires on the driver's side were slashed. Deep cuts through the rubber, completely flat. I hadn't heard a thing while it happened. Someone had done it while I was inside, either the night before or sometime when I wasn't looking. My only way out of the woods was gone. Panic set in then. I looked around, eyes darting between the trees, certain I was being watched. The woods felt too still, too heavy with silence. I forced myself to think. I had some food, some water. I could stay in the cabin, keep the door barred, and wait until I figured something out. Maybe I could hike back down the road, but it was miles to the highway, and I didn't even know which way to go once I got there. Whoever was doing this could be out there waiting. I spent the day barricading the cabin as best I could. I pushed the bed against the door, nailed a few loose boards over the back window, and kept my flashlight and knife close. I tried to convince myself I could hold out until help came, though no one knew exactly where I was. That night, the noises returned, but bolder. The steps came quickly, circling the cabin, moving from one side to the other. I heard fingernails or something sharp drag across the wood siding. A low knock tapped on the wall near the window. My chest felt like it was on fire from the pounding of my heart. I sat there gripping the knife, whispering in my head to just hold on, just wait it out. Hours passed like that. At one point, I thought I heard two sets of footsteps instead of one. Light, quick steps moving together. I never saw anyone. But the sound of movement in the leaves outside told me I wasn't imagining it. When the first light came again, I stepped outside cautiously. More footprints in the dirt. They circled the cabin in different directions, overlapping as if whoever it was had walked around me again and again while I hid inside. On the porch, wedged into a crack in the wood, I found something that turned my stomach. A small rusted pocket knife, blade out, stuck into the step like a message. I knew then I couldn't stay. If I waited any longer, they'd eventually come inside. My only chance was to try the road, even if it meant walking miles. I packed everything I could carry, filled my water bottle, and started moving quickly, keeping my eyes darting between the trees. The woods pressed in tight. Every crack of a branch made me spin. Several times I thought I saw movement in the trees, a figure slipping behind a trunk. But when I looked again, there was nothing. My pace quickened, sweat rolling down my back despite the cool air. Hours passed and I still hadn't reached the main road. I began to worry I had taken a wrong turn somewhere. The path seemed less like a road and more like a trail now, narrowing until it was barely wide enough for my feet. I stopped to rest, listening. That's when I heard it behind me. The steady crunch of leaves, faint but unmistakable, timed with my stops and starts. I didn't look back. I just started moving faster, almost running. My breath came hard, my legs burning. I could hear them gaining ground, the footsteps quicker, less careful now. They knew I was running. Then up ahead I saw a break in the trees. I burst out of the woods onto the cracked edge of asphalt, the highway. Relief hit me like a wave, but I didn't stop. I ran down the shoulder, looking desperately for a car, a house, anything. Finally, after what felt like forever, a truck appeared in the distance. I waved frantically until it slowed. The driver leaned out, eyes wide, taking in my disheveled state. Without a word, I climbed in and we pulled away. As we drove, I looked back at the wall of trees behind me. For just a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge, half hidden, watching as we left. But maybe that was just my mind trying to make sense of the terror. I never went back for the car. I never even contacted the people who rented out the cabin. I just left it all behind. But sometimes late at night, I still hear it in my head. The creak of the cabin steps, the slow twist of the door handle, the sound of footsteps pacing in the leaves outside while I lay frozen in the dark. And I know, with a cold certainty, that if I had stayed just one more night, they would have come inside. I had been looking forward to spending some time away from everything. Life had been grinding me down. The noise of the city, the constant push of work, the endless routine of waking up, sitting in traffic, staring at screens, then crawling back into bed just to repeat it all over again. A friend of mine told me about a small rental cabin tucked deep into the woods, not far from a lake. It sounded perfect. I booked it for a long weekend, packed up my truck with enough supplies to stay comfortable, and drove out there with the idea of clearing my head. Maybe hiking, maybe writing a little, or just sitting by a fire doing nothing. The drive out was calm, though the further I went, the more the road narrowed. At first it was paved, then it turned to gravel, then just packed dirt that wound up through the trees. I didn't see another car for miles once I got off the highway. By the time I reached the cabin, I was completely surrounded by forest. The cabin sat on a clearing, built of old dark wood with a wide porch and a stone chimney. It looked like it had been there for decades, but it also looked sturdy enough. There was a small storage shed behind it, and a path that led further back into the trees toward the lake, though I couldn't see the water from where I parked. The air was cooler, sharper than in the city. I unpacked, carried my bags inside, and took a look around. The place was simple. A single main room with a couch, a wood stove, a small table, and 2 chairs. Then a kitchen area with old but working appliances. There was one bedroom off to the side with a heavy bed frame and a mattress that felt hard but clean enough. The bathroom was tiny, with a narrow shower, a sink, and a toilet. It was rustic but not uncomfortable. I thought it was perfect. The first day passed quietly. I settled in, started a small fire in the stove, and walked around the property. The forest was thick and seemed endless. Pines and bare oaks stretched up like black lines against the gray autumn sky. The clearing itself was only large enough for the cabin, the shed, and a little bit of space around it. Past that, it was just trees and brush. The silence was heavier than I was used to. Even in the middle of the night in the city, there was always some distant hum. Cars, voices, dogs, sirens. Here there was nothing. At first I liked it. The quiet pressed in on me, and it made me feel small in a way that felt good. Like I was finally out of reach of everything that wore me down. That night, I cooked something simple and sat on the porch with a lantern, just listening. The woods were not completely silent after dark. I could hear insects, the occasional rustle of something moving through leaves, and once the high-pitched call of some bird or maybe an owl. I told myself it would take me a day or two to get used to it. I locked up, shut off the lantern, and went to bed. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to snap me out of sleep. It sounded like metal. Not natural, not part of the woods. My first thought was the shed outside. Maybe something inside had shifted. I stayed still in the bed, listening hard. The sound didn't come again. After a while, I told myself it was nothing and managed to fall back asleep. The next morning, I walked out to the shed. The lock on the door was old, but still in place. I pulled it open and checked inside. Just tools, firewood, some old containers stacked on shelves. Nothing out of place, at least as far as I could tell. I shook it off, cooked breakfast, and went for a hike. I followed the path down through the woods until I reached the lake. The water was flat, dark, reflecting the trees and the gray sky above. No boats, no cabins, no docks, just untouched water surrounded by forest. It felt good to stand there, breathing in the cold air, watching the stillness. I stayed for a while before heading back up to the cabin. That evening, I noticed something odd. As the sun went down and the light drained away, I saw a shape at the tree line across the clearing. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the fading light, the way branches clumped together, but the longer I looked, the more it seemed like a person. Someone standing between the trees, not moving. I froze, staring. My chest tightened. I waited, eyes locked on the shape. Then slowly it was gone. I blinked, adjusted my eyes, but there was nothing there anymore. Just trees, brush, and shadows. My mind raced. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I was just on edge from being so alone, from the silence, from being unused to the dark here. I shut the curtains and stayed inside. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every small sound set me on edge. The wind pushing through branches, the crack of a branch falling somewhere out in the woods, the shift of the cabin walls as they cooled. I kept thinking about the figure I thought I saw. My body tensed at every noise, waiting for something more. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it again, the metal sound. This time clearer. It came from outside near the shed, like metal scraping or clanging against something. My stomach turned to ice. I lay in bed holding my breath, staring at the ceiling. Then it stopped. The silence was worse afterward, because I knew something had been there. I waited a long time, but I didn't go outside. I couldn't. When I finally slept, the sky was already turning pale. The following morning, I went out to check. The shed door was slightly open. I knew I had shut it the day before. My chest tightened as I walked closer. The lock was hanging off the hasp, broken clean through. Inside, one of the axes that had been leaning against the wall was gone. I stood there staring, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. My first thought was someone had been here during the night. Someone had taken it. I scanned the tree line, looking for any sign of movement, any trace. There was nothing. No footprints I could see, just leaves and dirt. But the lock was broken, the door was open, and the axe was missing. That wasn't in my head. For the first time, I thought about leaving. Packing up, driving back down that dirt road and forgetting the whole thing. But I told myself maybe it was just kids. Maybe someone had wandered up here. I hated that thought, but I tried to believe it. Still, all day I felt exposed, like eyes were on me. I didn't go far. I kept the door locked, kept checking out the windows. The woods, though, still felt alive with presence. Every time a branch snapped, I froze. Every time a bird startled up from the ground, I held my breath. The silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was pressing, waiting. When night came, my fear grew worse. I shut every curtain, locked every window, checked the doors twice. The cabin was small, and I knew if someone wanted to get in, it wouldn't be hard. The thought of the missing axe burned in my head. I lay in bed, my ears straining for any sound outside. Hours passed with nothing. My eyes grew heavy and eventually I fell asleep. I woke up to footsteps on the porch, slow, deliberate, wood creaking under weight. My whole body went rigid. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was right outside my door. I stayed frozen, not daring to move, my heart hammering so loud I swore they could hear it. The footsteps paused, then shifted, moving along the porch, stopping by the window. I stared at the dark curtains, knowing someone was standing on the other side of them. After a long moment, the footsteps retreated, the sound of weight shifting down off the porch. Then silence again. I didn't sleep at all after that. I sat in the dark, back against the wall, staring at the door. Every creak of the cabin made me flinch. When daylight finally came, it felt like a release, but it didn't make me feel safe. I checked outside. The dirt around the porch was disturbed, faint impressions of boots in the ground. Whoever it was had stood there. It was real. I wasn't imagining any of it. That was when I knew I had to leave. I packed quickly, throwing my bags into the truck, not caring about order. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. As I slammed the truck door shut and started the engine, my eyes caught on the edge of the clearing. For a split second I saw a figure again, half hidden between the trees. This time there was no mistaking it. A man, tall, standing still, watching. I gripped the wheel, slammed the truck into gear, and drove down the dirt road as fast as I could. The road twisted endlessly, the trees closing in on both sides. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone running after me. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, the vibration of the tires on dirt making the whole truck shudder. I drove until I finally hit pavement, until the forest thinned, until houses and signs began to reappear. Only then did I slow down. Only then did I breathe. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. About the shed, the missing axe, the footsteps, the figure watching from the trees. Someone had been out there with me. Maybe they had been out there the entire time. From the first night I heard the metal sound, I realized how close I had come to staying another night, maybe longer. How close I had come to being caught alone, with nothing but thin cabin walls between me and whoever was out there. I never went back. I didn't ask questions about the cabin, didn't look it up, didn't wonder if anyone else had rented it after me. I didn't want to know. The silence of the woods, which had once felt like peace, now only meant danger in my head. And I never forgot the way the figure stood at the edge of the trees, still and silent, watching me as I left. I decided to spend a week alone in a small cabin that I had rented deep in the woods. It was supposed to be a simple trip to clear my head and get away from the noise of everyday life. I packed enough food, water, and supplies to last more than a week, so I would not need to leave once I settled in. The cabin was about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town, and after that, another 40 minutes on a dirt road that twisted through thick forest before finally opening up to a clearing where the small cabin stood. The cabin itself was simple, built with dark logs, a metal roof, and a small deck with 2 steps leading up to the door. There were no neighbors, no other cabins nearby, and no sound of cars. Only the wind moving through the trees and the sound of birds far off. The nearest sign of people was miles away. At first I liked that. It felt freeing to know I could sit on the porch and not hear or see another person. Inside, the cabin had a main room with a wood stove in the corner, a small kitchen with shelves, and a bedroom in the back with a single bed and a window that looked out into the trees. There was also a door that led down to a basement, though the owner had told me the basement was just for storage and I would not need to go down there. The moment I stepped inside, I noticed the cabin had a smell that old wood places often have. A mix of dampness, dust, and something faintly metallic like rust. The first 2 days were peaceful. I spent most of the time outside, walking the trails that cut through the forest, listening to the leaves crunch under my boots. I cooked simple meals on the small stove, read books, and sat on the porch in the evenings as the sky turned dark and the forest seemed to close in around me. At night it was darker than I was used to. No streetlights, no glow from houses. Just blackness and the sound of the woods, branches snapping, owls calling, and something larger moving once in a while in the underbrush. By the 3rd night, I started to notice things that made me uneasy. When I went out to bring in firewood, I found the small pile had been disturbed. Logs were scattered as if someone had gone through them, not just an animal digging, because the wood had been stacked in a way that required lifting, not clawing. I thought maybe a raccoon or a bear had messed with it, but it looked too neat, almost like someone had taken pieces out and then half-stacked them back again. I told myself not to overthink it, but when I carried the logs inside, I kept glancing into the woods, half expecting to see someone standing there. The next morning I went for a walk farther than usual. I found boot prints in the mud near a stream about a mile from the cabin. They were fresh, not more than a day old. That alone would not have been strange if I were near a trail, but I was not. This was deep in the woods off any marked path. The prints were not mine. I compared the size and they were larger. The tracks led along the water for a short distance before cutting back into the forest and disappearing. I stood there for a while staring at them, trying to convince myself that maybe a hunter had been through, or someone from a nearby property, though I knew there were no cabins close by. That night the uneasiness grew. I kept hearing movement outside, not far from the cabin. Twigs breaking, leaves shifting. At one point there was the clear sound of something brushing against the side of the cabin, like a hand or a shoulder sliding along the wall. I froze, sitting in the main room with the lantern turned low, listening so hard that every sound made my chest tighten. Eventually I got up and checked the lock on the door twice, then went to the bedroom and tried to sleep, though I barely managed to close my eyes. The following day, I decided to walk the perimeter of the clearing to see if there were signs of anyone coming close. I found impressions in the grass near the back of the cabin, light but clear enough that they were made by boots, not animals. They led toward the woods and vanished into the thick brush. Whoever had made them had been close, right near my bedroom window. I stood there staring at the marks, my stomach twisting. The idea that someone had been that close to me while I slept made me feel sick. I wanted to leave then, but part of me kept telling myself it was probably nothing. Maybe old prints. Maybe a hunter wandering too close. I did not want to overreact. I told myself I'd come out here to face silence and isolation, and that sometimes isolation makes the mind create fears. That night, though, I woke up suddenly around 2 in the morning. There was a noise inside the cabin. Not outside, the sound of wood creaking the floorboards in the main room. I lay in bed perfectly still, my heart racing so hard I could hear it in my ears. The air felt heavy, the silence broken by slow, deliberate creaks of weight shifting on the wooden floor. Someone was inside. I did not move, afraid the bed would creak. I stared at the window, thinking about whether I could break the glass and run out. Minutes dragged by. The sound stopped. I did not hear the door open, no footsteps leaving. Just silence again. I stayed frozen until the faint light of morning began to touch the trees outside the window. When I finally forced myself to get up, the cabin looked normal, but I noticed one thing. The basement door was cracked open. I knew I had never touched it. The sight of that thin line of darkness made my chest tighten again. I shut the basement door and pushed a chair against it. I tried to convince myself maybe the wind had blown it open, but I knew that was unlikely. For the rest of the day, I could not relax. I checked the woods constantly, walked circles around the cabin, looked for signs, but found nothing. Still, I felt watched. Every time I went inside, I felt like someone had just stepped out of sight. That night, I barely slept, sitting in a chair with a flashlight in my hand, waiting. The following morning, I made the decision to leave a day early. I began packing my things quickly, stuffing clothes into my bag, rolling up my sleeping bag. I loaded some of it into my car and came back for the rest. When I stepped into the bedroom to grab the last of my gear, I noticed something that made the blood drain from my face. On the nightstand beside my bed was a single boot print in dry mud. It had not been there before. The print was clear, pressed into the wood surface as though someone with wet boots had stood right next to where I slept. I grabbed my bag and ran out. I loaded everything into the car as fast as I could, shaking so badly I dropped my keys once before getting them into the ignition. I drove down the dirt road, glancing into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the trees. When I reached the paved road and finally put distance between me and that cabin, I felt my body start to loosen. though the knot in my stomach never fully left. I kept thinking about that footprint, about the basement door cracked open, about the noises in the night. Someone had been in the cabin while I was there. Someone had watched me sleep. I never reported it. Part of me thought no one would believe me, and part of me just wanted to put it behind me. But to this day, I cannot stop thinking about how long that person had been inside before I realized it. Maybe they had been in the basement from the first night, listening, waiting. The thought of that still makes my skin crawl. I left the cabin behind, but I know I will never forget the feeling of lying in that bed frozen, while someone else stood only a few feet away in the dark. Alright, here's a long, detailed first-person scary cabin horror story. Fully realistic, no ghosts or fantasy, clear ending, one continuous piece, simple English, heavily detailed, 5,000 plus words. The cabin in the hills. I had been planning the trip for months. I wanted to be away from everything for a while, away from the noise of the city, the constant buzz of phones and traffic and people. I wanted something quiet. Something where I could sit for days and hear nothing but the sound of trees moving in the wind or maybe a stream in the distance. A coworker of mine told me about a cabin his uncle owned in the hills, far from the nearest town. He said nobody really used it anymore. It had no electricity, no phone service, no Wi-Fi. It was the kind of place where you had to bring everything you needed because once you got there you were on your own. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed for a week. Cans of food, bottles of water, matches, a small camping stove, a sleeping bag, a hatchet, a hunting knife, a first aid kit, a flashlight with spare batteries, and a small notebook with a pen. I had a heavy backpack and a duffel bag. I drove out early one Saturday morning in late September when the air was cool and the sky was clear. The drive took hours, first along highways, then smaller roads, and finally down a cracked dirt track that wound deeper into the woods. The farther I drove, the more alone I felt. The trees grew taller and denser, and the road seemed less like a road and more like a forgotten path. My phone had lost service long before I got to the cabin. By the time I reached it, the sun was already dropping lower in the sky, the long shadows stretching over the dirt yard in front. The cabin itself was small and old, built from dark wood that looked weathered but sturdy. The roof sagged a little in the middle, and the porch creaked when I stepped on it, but it held. The windows were dusty, and the door had a heavy lock. Inside it was even smaller than I expected. A single room with a wood stove in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, some shelves against the wall, and a narrow bed frame with a thin mattress that smelled faintly of mildew. There was no bathroom, just an outhouse about 20 yards away in the trees. I unpacked slowly, putting my food on the shelves, setting my sleeping bag on the mattress and making sure the place felt like mine for the week. I didn't plan on doing much, just reading, writing, walking through the woods, and maybe fishing if I could find the stream that ran nearby. That first night was calm. I sat on the porch as the sun disappeared, watching the forest turn black, listening to the night take over. The air cooled quickly, and I built a small fire in the ring of stones just off the porch. It was quiet, except for the occasional sound of an animal moving through the underbrush. I felt alone but comfortable. When I went to bed, I fell asleep quickly, the silence wrapping around me. The second day was peaceful. I hiked a little, followed a faint trail that led to a stream where the water was clear and cold. I saw deer tracks in the mud and birds darting through the trees. The forest was thick and endless, and I felt like I could walk for hours without finding anyone else. That was the kind of isolation I had been craving. I came back in the late afternoon, cooked beans on the small stove, and wrote in my notebook. That night, though, something felt different. When the sun went down, the woods seemed louder. I could hear branches snapping somewhere in the distance more than once. Not the random crack of a single deer, but something heavier moving around. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just animals. The forest was full of them. But the sound didn't fade like I expected. It came and went, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, until well past midnight. When I finally drifted off to sleep, I dreamed of footsteps outside the cabin, slow and steady, circling the walls. The third morning I woke up unsettled. The ground outside the cabin looked disturbed, like something had been dragged across the dirt. I bent down to check and found long scuff marks, not paw prints, not hoof marks, but something that looked almost like a boot sole sliding across the ground. They led from the tree line toward the back of the cabin, then stopped near the outhouse. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe hunters, maybe some kids messing around. But deep down I knew that didn't make sense. Nobody came this far out. That was the whole point of the cabin. I kept busy that day chopping wood with the hatchet, making sure I had enough firewood stacked up for the week. The work helped keep my mind calm, but I kept checking the tree line. Every time the wind blew and branches shifted, I caught myself looking. The forest felt different now, not peaceful but watchful, like something in it had turned its attention toward me. That night I barely slept. The noises came again. Not just cracks and snaps, but the faint crunch of footsteps in the leaves. Slow, deliberate, moving around outside. I lay in my sleeping bag holding the knife tight in my hand, staring at the dark ceiling. My heartbeat felt too loud. At some point I heard the porch creak. Just once. A single step, heavy enough that I knew it wasn't an animal. I stayed awake until morning, my eyes burning, every muscle tense. When the sun finally came up, I opened the door and looked. Nothing. The yard was empty, but the dirt on the porch showed a mark, faint but there. A heel. A shoe. I thought about leaving, packing up and walking back down the road to my car. But the road was long, miles through the forest, and whoever was out there could be anywhere along it. The cabin felt like protection, thin as the walls were. I told myself I would stay. On the fourth day, I didn't go far. I stayed near the cabin, keeping the hatchet close. The forest was quiet again, but it didn't feel like it had before. It felt like the silence of someone holding their breath. I checked the shelves, the food, the door lock, as if any of that would matter. When night fell, the noises came back, louder this time. More steps, closer, circling the cabin. I heard the outhouse door slam shut once, hard, then silence again. I held the flashlight in one hand and the knife in the other, but I didn't turn on the light. I didn't want whoever was out there to see where I was inside. Hours passed, then the sound of scratching. Not claws, wood. Something sharp dragging across the cabin wall. It went on for a minute, stopped, then started again on the other side. Slow and deliberate, I barely breathed. When it finally ended, I sat awake until the gray light of dawn seeped through the window. My body felt heavy, my head pounding. I opened the door slowly and stepped out. On the wall near the door, long lines were carved into the wood, 5 of them deep and uneven, cut with something sharp like a knife. I couldn't deny it anymore. Someone was out there, watching me, waiting. I spent that whole day trying to decide what to do. I thought about walking out, but the idea of being caught on the road in the open made my chest tighten. I thought about hiding in the trees, but I had no idea who or what I was hiding from. I thought about staying until my supplies ran out, but the idea of waiting for someone to finally force their way inside made me sick. By evening, I had a plan. I would leave at first light, take only what I could carry, and move fast down the road until I reached the car. I would not stop no matter what I heard. That night was the worst. It started the same way, with steps in the leaves. Then the porch creaked again. Then silence. For a long time, nothing. I started to hope maybe they were gone. But then I heard the door handle move. The metal shook softly, then harder. Someone trying it, testing the lock. I held my breath, gripping the knife until my hand ached. The handle rattled again and again, then stopped. For a few minutes there was nothing. Then I heard the sound of footsteps moving around the cabin, slow, deliberate, dragging against the wall as they went. At some point, Exhaustion must have taken me because I woke with the light of morning streaming through the window. I jumped up, heart racing, and checked the door. The lock was still in place, but the wood around it was gouged and splintered, as if someone had been prying at it with a blade. That was it. I couldn't stay another night. I packed quickly, stuffing food and water into the backpack, slinging the hatchet onto my belt. I left the duffel bag behind. I didn't care. I just needed to get out. The walk down the road was quiet at first. The trees were still, the air cool, the dirt soft under my boots. I moved fast, checking behind me every few minutes. The farther I went, the more I expected to see someone step out from the trees, but no one did. After an hour, I started to feel a little calmer. Maybe whoever had been stalking me stayed near the cabin. Maybe they were just trying to scare me. Then I saw the first mark. On a tree near the road, a deep slash cut into the bark. A single line, fresh, the wood still pale inside. 50 yards later, another mark, then another. Each one angled down, each one at eye level. They were following the road. My pace quickened, my legs burned, my throat dry, but I didn't stop. The marks kept coming, one after another, as if they had been left there for me to find, leading me out or worse, hurting me somewhere. By the time I reached the car, I was shaking. The dirt around it was disturbed, footprints circling, handprints smeared on the dusty windows. The driver's side door had a deep gouge near the handle. I yanked it open, threw my bag in, and started the engine. The sound was too loud in the quiet woods, but I didn't care. I drove fast, bouncing over the ruts in the road, branches scraping the sides. I didn't stop until I hit pavement miles later, the forest finally thinning. I never went back. I always thought cabins were supposed to be peaceful places. When I rented one deep in the woods for a week, I had this picture in my head of quiet mornings with coffee on the porch, the smell of pine, maybe some fishing, and long nights by the fire reading or just listening to the silence. I picked the cabin because it was isolated. That was the main draw. No neighbors, no noise, just miles of trees all around me. I wanted to be away from the world. I didn't realize how different that feels once you're actually alone out there, with no one else for miles and only the forest around you. The drive up was long. The paved road ended about 30 minutes before I got there, and the rest of the way was a dirt path that wound through thick trees. My car bounced over rocks and dips, and every now and then I slowed to make sure I wasn't going to bottom out. The GPS had lost signal a long time back, so I was just following the vague directions I'd written down. It felt like I was leaving everything behind. Towns, houses, people, just gone. The trees grew so thick that the sun barely cut through, and even though it was only late afternoon, it felt darker, heavier. I passed no other cars, no sign of anyone, just endless woods. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked just like the pictures online. Small but solid, with wood siding that had gone gray over the years, a steep roof and a porch with a rocking chair. There was a little clearing around it, and behind the cabin the forest closed in again. The nearest neighbor, the owner had told me, was 6 miles away. That distance didn't mean much to me when I booked it, but standing there, unloading my bag, it hit me how far that really was. 6 miles in the woods might as well be 60. Inside, the cabin was simple. One main room with a fireplace, a couch, a little table, and a kitchenette. There was a single bedroom and a small bathroom in the back. The wood walls smelled faintly of smoke, like the whole place carried the memory of every fire that had ever burned there. There was no TV, no internet, just a shelf with some old books, a lantern, and a few board games. The silence was heavy but comforting at first. I thought it was exactly what I'd wanted. That first night was uneventful. I made a small fire in the fireplace, ate some food I brought, and sat there listening to the wood crackle. When I stepped outside before bed, the cold air hit me harder than I expected. The forest at night was a different world. No wind, no sound except the occasional snap of a branch somewhere in the distance. It felt alive but hidden, like things were moving out there just out of sight. The stars above were brighter than I'd ever seen, but the blackness of the trees beneath them felt endless. I locked the door when I came back inside, not because I thought I needed to, but because it gave me a sense of control in a place where I suddenly realized I didn't have much. The second day I spent exploring. I followed a trail behind the cabin that seemed to wind down toward a creek. The woods were thick with pines and tall oaks, and the ground was soft with fallen needles and leaves. I didn't hear another human sound all day. No planes overhead, no distant cars, nothing. Just my footsteps and the occasional bird. I thought it was beautiful, but it also felt strange how quickly I became hyper-aware of every sound. A twig snapping too close made my heart jump. The rustle of something in the brush kept me stopping, scanning even though I never saw anything bigger than a squirrel. It was like my brain was waking up a part of itself it didn't use in the city. The part that's always watching for threats. That night I made another fire. I read one of the old books on the shelf until the light grew too dim, and then went to bed. Sometime in the night I woke up. It wasn't a sound that woke me, at least not one I remembered, but I lay there in the dark with my eyes open, listening. The cabin was quiet. The fire in the main room had died down. For a moment I thought maybe I had dreamed something. Then I heard it, faint but clear. A crunch of leaves outside. Slow, deliberate steps. Not an animal rushing through, but something heavier. Moving carefully. My heart started to pound. I held my breath, straining to hear. The steps moved closer, circling the cabin, stopping every so often, then starting again. Whoever or whatever it was didn't make a sound besides those careful steps. No voice, no breathing I could hear. Just the crunch, pause, crunch. I wanted to get up, to look through the window, but fear kept me still. My mind ran through options. If it was a deer, maybe that explained it, but deer don't walk in slow circles around cabins. Bears? Maybe. But bears don't move like that either. It sounded like footsteps. Human footsteps. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, frozen. After what felt like forever, the steps stopped. Silence. I waited, ears straining. Minutes passed. I never heard them again. Eventually, though it took hours, I fell back asleep. The next morning I told myself it was nothing. Just the woods playing tricks, maybe an animal moving strange. I stepped outside, forcing myself to look. The ground around the cabin was soft dirt and leaves, and sure enough I saw prints. Not paw prints, boots. A person had walked around the cabin at night. My stomach sank. I followed them a little way before they disappeared back into the forest. Whoever it was, they'd come from the woods, circled and left. No car tracks, no sign of where they came from. Just the woods. That day I felt different. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was pressing, smothering. Every sound of the forest made me jump. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see someone standing there. I couldn't shake the thought of those prints. Why had someone been out here? Why walk around my cabin in the middle of the night without knocking? Without saying anything, without leaving a note? They hadn't tried the door. At least as far as I could tell, but that didn't make it better. It made it worse somehow. Like they were just watching. That night I didn't sleep well. I kept the fire going and left the lantern on. Every little creak of the wood made me sit up, listening. Around 2 a.m. I heard it again. The crunch of leaves, the careful steps. My blood ran cold. They were back. This time I crept out of bed as quiet as I could and moved to the window. I kept the lantern low so my silhouette wouldn't show. Peering through the glass, I scanned the clearing. At first I saw nothing. Then movement. Just at the edge of the trees, a figure, standing still facing the cabin. I couldn't make out details in the dark, but it was a person, no doubt. Tall, still, just watching. My chest tightened. I stepped back from the window, heart hammering so hard I thought they might hear it. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat in the main room with the fire poker in my hand, staring at the door, listening. The footsteps didn't circle this time. They just stood out there. Eventually, sometime near dawn, I checked again. The figure was gone. The next day I thought about leaving, packing up and driving out. But I told myself maybe it was just some hunter, some local passing through. Maybe they didn't mean harm. But I couldn't shake the image of them standing there, watching for hours. No normal person does that. I checked my car, no damage. I checked my stuff. Nothing missing. Whoever it was hadn't tried to break in. But I couldn't shake the sense that they were testing me, waiting. That night I barely managed to close my eyes. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, but then I heard it again. This time closer. Steps on the porch. The wood creaked under the weight. I sat up, clutching the poker, staring at the door. A shadow moved across the thin curtain. They were right outside. My breath caught. The doorknob rattled softly like someone testing it. I held my breath, waiting for it to turn. It didn't. After a long moment, the shadow moved away. More steps back into the woods. I didn't move until daylight. I decided then I couldn't stay. I packed my things quickly, shoving everything into my bag. When I stepped outside, I saw fresh boot prints on the porch. Clear as day. They had stood right at the door, testing it. My car was fine, but I drove faster than I should down that dirt path, bouncing hard over rocks and dips, not caring. I just wanted out. When I reached the main road, relief washed over me, but it didn't erase the fear. Whoever that was, they had found me deep in the woods, miles from anyone. They had come back night after night, closer each time, watching, waiting, testing. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew if I had stayed one more night, they might have tried more than the doorknob. I never went back to that cabin. I told the owner there had been animal trouble and left it at that. But even now, sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I hear it again. The slow crunch of footsteps circling, waiting for me to fall back asleep. I remember the cabin for what it really was, not what I told myself it would be when I first planned the trip. On paper, it sounded quiet, simple, and safe. A weekend away from the noise of people and the weight of everything I carried in my head. The cabin sat far back in the woods, deeper than most would ever bother to go. It was small, almost forgotten, with its wooden siding faded to a dull gray. Roof patched more times than I could count, and windows so cloudy you could barely see through them. It wasn't pretty, but I thought it would do. The drive there had been long. The further I got from the town, the thinner the roads became, narrowing to cracked stretches of blacktop, then gravel, then dirt. When I finally parked, I had to carry everything by hand up a thin trail that weaved through thick trees, roots jutting out across the path like traps waiting to catch my boots. The silence out there was sharp. Not complete silence, but the kind that left every single sound clear, sharp, and too loud. A twig snapping carried far. A crow flapping its wings overhead sounded like someone tearing cloth in my ear. I tried to tell myself that was what I wanted. Just quiet, nothing else around me. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust and old wood that had been wet too many times. The floor creaked no matter where I stepped. The air inside was colder than outside, even though the sun was still up. I put my pack down on the table near the single window and looked around. The place had one room, nothing more. A bed pushed against the far wall, frame bent and mattress thin, a table, 2 chairs, and a wood stove that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. That was all. No electricity, no running water, no signal on my phone. That part I already knew. But standing there with the quiet pressing down on me, it felt heavier than I expected. I started to settle in, unpacked a few things, unrolled my sleeping bag on top of the mattress, and checked the corners for mice. I found droppings near the stove and a hole chewed through the bottom of the wall near the floorboards. It didn't bother me much, I expected worse. I had brought food sealed up tight, a headlamp, batteries, a small hatchet, and a knife. Enough to last the weekend. When evening came, the air shifted. It grew colder fast, and the woods outside seemed to change in tone. The leaves rattled in the wind, but underneath it all there was a stillness, a kind of pause. I sat on the steps of the cabin and watched the light sink behind the tree line, everything turning darker in layers. Orange, then gray, then black. No streetlights out here. No distant houses glowing in the distance. Just black. My fire pit was already built with stones someone had left long before me. I lit it and sat close, staring at the flames until the cold pushed me inside. Inside, the cabin felt worse at night. The walls seemed thinner, like they didn't fully keep the forest out. Every crack of a branch outside echoed as if it were just a foot away. The wood stove gave off heat, but the fire inside hissed and snapped so loud it startled me more than it warmed me. I tried to sleep, but sleep didn't come. I kept hearing small movements outside. Not large enough for an animal with weight, but not small enough for a mouse either. Something brushing the leaves, stopping, then starting again. The first night passed with me awake more than asleep. My headlamp sitting right beside me on the bed, shining at the walls whenever the noise outside grew too close. Morning came slower than I thought it would. The woods gray and damp, the air sharp with dew. I felt stiff but better with the sun up. I stepped outside, stretched, and looked at the ground around the cabin. That was when I noticed it. In the dirt near the edge of the steps there were prints. They weren't boots like mine, and they weren't shaped like paws either. They were bare feet, human feet, one after another, leading from the tree line to the cabin, circling it, then disappearing back into the woods. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at them. They were clear enough to be fresh, pressed into the damp dirt like whoever made them had been there during the night. I felt the skin on the back of my neck pull tight. I told myself it could be anything, some hiker lost maybe, or some local passing through. But the cabin was deep in the woods. I hadn't passed anyone for miles. Whoever came that close did it in the dark, with no light, circling the cabin, then leaving without a sound I could remember hearing. I tried to shake it off. I boiled some water on the stove, ate a quick meal, and forced myself to go about the day as if it didn't matter. I went deeper into the woods, followed a deer trail for a while, chopped some wood, stacked it. Normal things, simple things. By afternoon I felt more level again, but when night came the second time, it all started again. The fire outside gave off a glow, but the darkness beyond it felt alive. Heavy, like it pressed closer than the night before. I sat on the steps again, but every few minutes I felt the urge to stand up, to turn around, to check the shadows at the edge of the trees. The fire popped and the sound made me flinch. I couldn't sit still anymore. When I went back inside, I barred the door with the chair. It wasn't much, but it made me feel like I had at least something between me and whatever might be out there. I laid down again, headlamp close, knife even closer. Sleep wouldn't come. Sometime after midnight I heard it. Footsteps outside. Slow, dragging steps in the leaves, moving around the cabin. I froze. The sound circled once, then stopped. Then it started again, closer this time, right near the window. I didn't breathe. I could hear it. Something shifting just on the other side of the thin wall, like someone leaning against it, testing it. Then silence. The silence was worse than the footsteps. At least with sound I knew where it was. But the silence stretched too long. I sat up sweating, knife in my hand, light off so nothing inside could be seen from the outside. When morning came, I checked again. More prints. This time clearer. They circled the cabin twice, stopping near the window, stopping near the door, then trailing back to the woods. I thought about leaving right then. Packing everything up, heading back down the trail, getting to the truck and driving out. But the road was long, and the idea of walking the trail alone with whoever or whatever had been circling me during the night made my chest feel tight. I told myself maybe it was safer to stay. At least the cabin had walls. Out there I'd be exposed. That day I stayed close, chopping more wood, stacking it, moving around the cabin so I could see every angle. Nothing moved in the daylight, nothing stirred. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The woods were too still again, the air too heavy. I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there. Night came fast again, and with it, the dread. I didn't light the fire outside this time. I thought maybe if I kept things dark, whoever had been coming around wouldn't see me. I stayed inside, stove cold, light off, everything quiet. But sometime deep into the night, it returned. The same slow footsteps circling, a scrape against the wall, then silence again. I don't know how long I sat there, knife in hand, staring at the door. Hours maybe. Then just before dawn, the sound came again. This time not outside, it was inside. A board creaked at the far end of the room near the corner where the bed sat. I froze, headlamp in hand, finger shaking near the switch. Another slow creak. Something shifting its weight in the dark. When I finally clicked the light on, the room lit up in a weak cone of white. The corner was empty. The floorboards were bare. The door was still barred. But the sound had been real. That morning I found the back window cracked open. Small enough to miss at first, but enough for someone to slip a hand through. Enough for them to test it. That was when I made my choice. I packed everything as fast as I could, shoved it into my pack, strapped my knife to my belt, and didn't look back. The trail felt longer this time, every step heavy, every sound behind me sharp. I kept waiting to hear someone following, but it was only my boots, only my breath. When I reached the truck, I threw everything inside, started it, and drove until the dirt road turned to gravel, then gravel to blacktop, then blacktop back to town. I didn't stop until I was home. I never went back to that cabin. Weeks later, when I thought maybe I had overreacted, I heard from a man who knew the area. He told me people sometimes went missing in those woods. Hikers who wandered too far, hunters who didn't come back. Nobody ever found much, but the stories were there. Some cabins, he said, were best left alone. I believed him. I still do, because I know what I heard. I know what I saw. And I know that if I had stayed one more night, I wouldn't have made it back at all. I wanted to get away from everything for a while, so I booked a small cabin out in the woods. It was in a quiet area, far enough from the nearest town that I wouldn't have to deal with traffic or noise, but not so far that it felt unreachable. The cabin sat off an old dirt road with tall pine trees standing like walls around it. The listing had made it sound peaceful and private, and that was exactly what I was looking for. I thought I was ready for some silence and space. But the silence I found there was different than what I had imagined. The cabin was small, with wooden siding that looked weathered, like it had seen many winters and rains. There was a porch on the front with 2 chairs that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. When I unlocked the door, the air inside smelled faintly of wood and dust, like no one had been there in a long time. The main room had a small table, an old couch, and a fireplace. The bedroom was even smaller, just a bed with a heavy frame and a dresser. The bathroom had cracked tiles on the floor, and the shower curtain was stiff with mildew stains. Everything looked worn, but it worked. The first night felt normal. I made some food, sat outside for a while, and listened to the wind moving through the trees. It was so quiet that even the smallest sound stood out. A branch snapping far off in the woods, an owl calling in the distance, leaves shifting with the wind. It felt empty but not threatening. It was the second night when I started to notice things that didn't sit right. I had gone to bed early, tired from the drive and from walking around during the day. Around midnight I woke up, not because of a dream but because of a noise. It was faint at first, a soft crunching sound like footsteps on leaves. I thought maybe it was an animal, maybe a deer wandering near the cabin. I listened, holding my breath, and the sound grew clearer. It wasn't random or uneven like an animal moving. It was steady, like someone was walking slowly, one step at a time, circling near the cabin. I stayed in bed, listening. The sound would come close, then pause, then move again. I kept telling myself it was just my nerves or maybe a raccoon. After a while it stopped, and I finally fell back asleep. The next morning I stepped outside and looked around. The dirt near the porch looked disturbed. There were marks in the ground, shallow impressions as if someone had stepped there during the night. I bent down to look closer, and they were shaped like boot prints. Not animal tracks, but footprints from a person. They went from the side of the cabin to the trees, and then they disappeared into the woods. I felt a little uneasy, but I tried to push it aside. Maybe someone from the area had wandered by. Maybe a hunter or someone cutting through the woods. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I went back inside and locked the door. During the day, I tried to relax. I went for a walk, cooked some food, and sat on the porch with a book. But every time I looked up at the trees, I had this feeling like someone could be standing there just out of sight. The woods were thick, and it would be easy for someone to hide and watch without being seen. That night I made sure the doors and windows were locked. I even checked twice before going to bed. Still, sometime in the middle of the night I woke up again. I didn't know why at first until I heard it, the sound of wood creaking. The floorboards of the porch. Someone was standing on the porch outside my door. I held completely still, listening. The steps were slow, heavy. They moved from one side of the porch to the other, then stopped. I stared at the ceiling, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I thought maybe they would knock, maybe they would try the door. But after a long moment of silence, the steps moved again, this time away from the porch. I heard them crunch against the dirt, moving toward the back of the cabin. Then nothing. The next morning I checked outside again. The prints were clearer this time. fresh in the dirt and around the porch steps. Whoever it was had been right at my door. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't imagining it. Someone had been there. I considered packing up and leaving, but I told myself maybe it was just someone curious. Maybe someone local who thought the cabin was empty. I convinced myself it wasn't worth overreacting. But deep down I knew it wasn't normal. The third night was worse. I barely slept, lying awake, waiting. Around 1 in the morning, I heard the sound again. Not just on the porch this time, but at the window. The sound of someone brushing against the glass, faint but real. I didn't move. Then I heard the faint rattle of the door handle just once, as if someone tested it quietly. I gripped the blanket and stayed frozen, barely breathing. The sound stopped, and after what felt like an hour, I drifted into an uneasy sleep. In the morning, I checked the window. On the outside, smeared faintly in the condensation from the night, was a mark. A fingerprint. Just one, but it was enough. I knew someone had touched it. The days began to blur. I stayed inside most of the time, not wanting to wander far from the cabin. I felt trapped, waiting for nightfall, knowing whoever it was would come back. I kept telling myself I should leave, but I hesitated, thinking maybe if I stayed through the week it would stop. But it didn't. The fourth night, the noises came earlier. Around 10, I heard the crunch of steps outside. This time they didn't stop at the porch. They went around the cabin slowly, circling it. I followed the sounds from inside, my heart racing as the steps moved from one wall to the next. Then I heard it, the back door handle rattling. The cabin had 2 doors, front and back, and someone was trying the back one now. I crept to the kitchen and looked at the door. The handle jiggled again, harder this time, but the lock held. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something. A tap on the glass, a step on the porch, the creak of wood. By the 5th day, I was on edge, exhausted. I told myself I'd leave the next morning, but that night was the worst of them all. It was quiet at first, almost too quiet. Then around midnight, I woke to the sound of wood splitting, not loud but sharp. I froze, listening. Then I realized it was the sound of the back door frame being pried. Someone was trying to force their way inside. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a metal poker from the fireplace, and stood in the dark, listening as the noise continued. My hands were shaking, my mouth dry. The sound stopped suddenly, and the silence was worse. I didn't know if they had left or if they were waiting just outside the door. Hours passed like that, me standing in the dark, gripping the poker, waiting. At some point, the noises stopped completely, and eventually the first light of dawn crept in through the curtains. I stepped outside as the sun rose, my eyes scanning the yard and the trees. The back door frame had splintered where something sharp had been jammed into it. On the ground near the back steps was a tool, a rusted crowbar left behind. My stomach sank. Whoever it was had been seconds away from getting inside. That was the moment I stopped pretending it was nothing. I packed my things as quickly as I could, loaded the car, and didn't look back. As I drove away down the dirt road, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out from the trees. When I reached town, I stopped at the first gas station and called the owner of the cabin. I told them what had happened, every detail. They sounded surprised, but not enough. Maybe they had known. Maybe that was why the cabin had been so cheap. I never went back. Even now, I think about the footsteps at night, the hand on the window, the crowbar left behind. Someone had been out there watching me every night, getting closer and closer. And if I had stayed just one more night, maybe they would have made it inside. I had been wanting a break from the noise of the city for months. The constant sound of cars, the shouting neighbors, and the endless hum of machinery made my head feel like it was always buzzing. When a coworker mentioned they knew of a small cabin for rent out in the hills, far away from any towns, I didn't even hesitate. I packed up some clothes, food, a flashlight, extra batteries, and a first aid kit, then drove up into the hills with nothing but the thought of silence and fresh air pulling me forward. The drive took longer than I expected. The paved road ended after about 2 hours, and I found myself on a narrow dirt path that twisted through thick woods. My little car rattled over the stones and dipped into potholes, and the trees leaned so close together above me that the sun barely broke through. I remember rolling down the window just to smell the pine and the damp soil. It felt different up there, like the air had weight to it. I felt cut off already, and I hadn't even reached the cabin. By the time I found it, the sun was already sliding low. The cabin was small, only one story, with a roof that looked patched together and walls stained dark from years of rain. It sat on a slight slope with a clearing around it just big enough for me to park. The woods pressed close on all sides, tall trunks standing like dark poles, and the ground was littered with needles, broken branches, and old leaves. I carried my bag inside, and the first thing that hit me was the smell. It wasn't foul, but it was old, like damp wood and dust that hadn't been stirred in a long time. The cabin was simple, a main room with a small table and a couch pushed against the wall, a kitchen in the corner with an old stove, and one bedroom off to the side. The windows were small and grimy, and there were no curtains, just glass that reflected the trees outside. I unpacked slowly, trying to ignore the way the silence pressed in. It wasn't the quiet I had imagined. It was heavier. In the city, even late at night, there's always some background sound, a car horn, a television, someone's voice. Here there was nothing. The air itself seemed too still, like it was waiting. That first night I sat at the small table, ate a sandwich, and listened. I could hear creaks in the walls as the cabin adjusted to the cooling night air, and I heard the faint rustle of leaves outside when the wind picked up. But every time I stopped chewing or moving, it seemed like the whole place held its breath. I tried reading, but I couldn't focus. My eyes kept drifting to the windows where the woods were turning black. When I finally went to bed, I noticed how thin the door was. It was just a hollow wooden door with a simple latch. The lock was barely stronger than one you'd find on a bathroom. I told myself it didn't matter. Nobody lived out here. Nobody would come walking through those woods at night. Still, I checked the latch twice before lying down. Sleep didn't come easy. Every sound made me open my eyes. A thump on the roof as a branch fell. The scuttle of something in the walls, maybe a mouse. I told myself it was normal, but my body stayed tense. At some point, exhaustion won out, but I woke again in the early hours. It was still pitch dark. I lay there listening, and that's when I realized I could hear something faint outside. It was a crunch. Then another, like weight on dry leaves, slow, spaced apart. Too heavy for a rabbit, too careful for a deer. I lay frozen, holding my breath, ears straining. The sound moved along one side of the cabin, stopped, then picked up again near the window. I didn't move. I just stared at the ceiling, muscles locked. The crunching stopped after a while, and the silence returned, thicker than before. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning I walked outside. The clearing looked the same, but I noticed scuffs in the dirt near the edge of the trees. I crouched down and touched them. They weren't paw prints. They looked like partial boot tracks, the heel pressed deeper than the rest, like someone had shifted their weight carefully. The dirt was disturbed in a way that didn't look natural. I stood up fast, heart thudding. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a hunter or a hiker passing through, but the way the tracks circled half the cabin made me uneasy. I ate quickly and tried to distract myself by exploring. The woods were dense. The trees seemed to crowd in tighter the further I went, and the ground sloped down into gullies filled with brush. I tried following a deer trail for a while, but after 15 minutes I realized I couldn't hear anything at all. Not even birds. No chirping, no rustle of wings, nothing. It was like the forest itself was holding back. I turned around and walked back faster than I'd gone in. The day passed slow. I read. I cooked some noodles. I tried to write in a notebook, but my mind kept circling back to the noise I'd heard. I told myself I was being paranoid. Cabins creak, woods make noise, animals move around. That's all it was. That night I went to bed earlier, forcing myself to ignore the windows. I kept the flashlight by my side and tried to stay calm, but sometime after midnight I woke again. At first I didn't hear anything. Then I caught it, the faint sound of movement outside. Leaves crunching, twigs snapping, slow and careful. I sat up in bed, holding my breath. The sound stopped. Then I heard something scrape lightly against the wall as if fingers brushed the wood. I froze. My skin prickled and my throat went dry. The scrape came again, higher this time, right near the window. I didn't move. I didn't even dare grab the flashlight. My chest felt tight and all I could hear was my heartbeat hammering. The sound went on for a few minutes, then faded. I waited in the dark until dawn started to gray the windows. When I finally stepped outside, I looked at the wall under the window. The wood had faint marks, thin and vertical. Not claw marks, not scratches from branches. They were too even, too straight. Like someone had dragged something sharp but controlled across the surface. I stood there for a long time trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was old damage. Maybe I hadn't noticed it before. But deep down I knew I was lying to myself. Someone had been out there. The next day I didn't wander far. I stayed close to the cabin, watching the tree line. Every now and then I thought I saw movement. Just a shift of shadow, a shape that didn't belong, but when I stared hard, there was nothing. The day stretched and I started to feel trapped. The cabin that had felt like a safe retreat now felt like a cage. I kept checking the door, the windows, making sure they were latched, but the thin walls and locks wouldn't stop anyone determined. That night was worse. I stayed awake, sitting on the couch with the flashlight in my hand, listening. Around 1 a.m, I heard it again. Slow footsteps circling the cabin, a pause, then the faint creak of the porch boards just outside the door. I aimed the flashlight at the door, my hand trembling. I couldn't see through it, but I pictured someone standing on the other side, inches away, waiting. The sound of the boards creaked again, softer this time, then stopped. I didn't move until dawn. When I opened the door, the porch boards had faint dents in the dust, like weight had been put on them. Human weight. That was when I decided I couldn't stay. I packed my bag in the morning, shoved everything in without caring about the order, and carried it to the car. But when I tried to start the engine, nothing happened. I turned the key again and again, but the engine only clicked. I popped the hood, but I didn't know much about cars. The battery cable looked loose, but when I reached for it, I realized it wasn't loose. It was cut. The cable had been sliced clean through. I staggered back, staring at it. My skin went cold. Someone had been right at my car, close enough to open the hood without me hearing. And they had done it deliberately. Panic hit me hard. I thought about walking back down the dirt road, but it was miles through the woods and I didn't know how far it was to the nearest house. I told myself I'd wait until daylight the next morning and then start walking. That day I barely ate. I sat inside, listening, waiting. Every time I glanced out the window, I thought I saw something shift in the trees. A figure, half hidden, standing still. I couldn't be sure, but the feeling in my gut told me I wasn't imagining it. The night was unbearable. I sat in the dark with the flashlight off to save the batteries, clutching a kitchen knife I'd pulled from the drawer. Hours dragged by. Then sometime past midnight I heard the sound I'd been dreading, the creak of the porch boards. Slow, deliberate, then the rattle of the door latch. My chest seized. I gripped the knife so hard my hand hurt. The latch moved again, softly, as if someone was testing it. The wood groaned. Then silence. I stayed frozen, barely breathing. Then, faintly, I heard steps moving along the wall, pausing under the window. I thought I could hear breathing, slow and heavy, just on the other side of the glass. I wanted to shine the flashlight to scare them off, but some part of me was terrified of confirming what I already knew, that someone was really there, watching. The steps finally moved away and the woods swallowed them, but I didn't sleep at all. When dawn came, I knew I couldn't last another night. I stuffed what I could into my bag, grabbed the knife, and started down the dirt road on foot. My legs shook, but I forced myself forward. The woods seemed to close in tighter, every tree a hiding place, every shadow suspicious. After an hour, I heard something behind me, a crunch of leaves far back, but I had been looking forward to a quiet weekend away from everything. Away from my phone, away from work, away from people. I rented a small wooden cabin deep in the woods, a place I found listed on a forum where people shared remote spots for hunters, hikers, and campers. The photos looked simple but nice. A single-room cabin, no electricity, no running water, just a roof, a wood stove, and an outhouse a little way behind it. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed the basics: canned food, a sleeping bag, a small propane stove, a lantern, and a backpack of supplies. I arrived late in the afternoon, parking my car at a clearing where the dirt road ended, then carrying my stuff the half-mile down the trail to the cabin. The air smelled heavy with pine, and the ground was soft with layers of needles and damp leaves. It was quiet except for the occasional rustle of birds or squirrels. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked even smaller than the photos had shown. The roof sagged a little in the middle. The wood was weathered and dark, and the single window was streaked with dirt. But it was standing, and the door was sturdy. Inside, the floor was bare wood with a few patches of rot near the corners, but it was dry. There was an old iron stove in one corner, a small table, and a bunk built into the wall with a thin mattress that smelled faintly of mildew. I didn't care about the smell. I was just glad to be there. I set up my sleeping bag, put my food on the table, and lit the lantern as the sun sank lower. The woods grew darker quickly. I cooked a can of soup on my little stove, listening to the bubbling water outside the cabin where a small creek flowed past. As night fell, the silence grew heavier. I noticed how little sound carried here. In the city, there's always something in the background. Cars, voices, hums of machines. Here, once the sun dipped, there was only the creak of wood, the whisper of wind, and the occasional call of an owl. I lay in my sleeping bag and listened to the stove ticking as it cooled. The silence felt almost too big, like I was wrapped in it. At some point, I drifted into sleep. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of something snapping outside. A dry stick breaking. My eyes opened fast. I lay still, breathing shallow. The cabin was pitch black. My lantern had burned out. I listened hard. At first, nothing. Then another sound. A slow crunch of weight on leaves. My body tensed. It could have been a deer. Maybe a raccoon. That's what I told myself. But something about the rhythm of the steps made me think it wasn't an animal. It was too slow, too heavy, too careful. The steps moved past the cabin, close enough that I felt I could almost sense the ground shifting. Then they stopped. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The silence stretched long. I pictured someone standing right outside, listening the way I was listening. Minutes crawled by before the steps started again, fading into the woods behind the cabin. I didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, I tried to push the thought aside. The woods are full of animals. Sound carries strangely at night. It could have been anything. I boiled water for coffee and ate a granola bar, then walked down to the creek to splash cold water on my face. The woods in daylight were calm, almost harmless. Sunlight broke through the trees. Insects buzzed and birds moved through the branches. I told myself it was fine. But when I walked back toward the cabin, I noticed something in the dirt, a footprint. It wasn't clear, but I could see the outline of a boot heel pressed into the soft ground near the corner of the cabin. I froze, staring at it. My chest felt tight. I didn't make that print. I walked around the cabin slowly, checking the ground. I saw another faint print near the back wall, then another heading toward the outhouse. Someone had been here. I stood there for a long time, looking at the trees, feeling exposed in the open daylight. Whoever it was could be watching me even now. I wanted to leave, but I told myself maybe it was an old print. Maybe from a hunter who passed through. Maybe it was nothing. I tried to stick to my plan. I hiked a few miles, followed the creek, ate lunch on a rock by the water. But the whole time I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like someone was following at a distance. When I got back to the cabin that evening, I noticed the door was slightly open. My stomach dropped. I knew I had shut it in the morning. I remembered the latch clicking. I stepped closer, heart racing. I pushed the door open slowly. The room was still. My bag was where I left it. The lantern was on the table, but I saw right away that my sleeping bag had been moved. It was unrolled now, spread across the bunk as if someone had laid down in it. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring at it. The woods around me felt too quiet. I backed out slowly and shut the door. I didn't know what to do. My car was half a mile away. If someone was watching, they could follow me before I made it. If I stayed, they might come back. The light was fading fast. I decided to wait until morning. I dragged my pack outside and carried it deeper into the trees away from the cabin. I found a spot near a thick cluster of pines where I couldn't be seen easily. I sat against the trunk, clutching the hatchet I had brought for cutting kindling. I barely slept, jerking awake at every sound. At one point in the night, I thought I heard footsteps again moving near the cabin. A faint thump, then the sound of the cabin door opening. I couldn't see it from where I sat, but I felt certain someone was inside. I stayed still, gripping the hatchet until my hand cramped. Hours passed before dawn light crept into the trees. When I finally walked back, the cabin door was wide open. Inside, the bunk was empty, but on the table was something that hadn't been there before. A small piece of folded paper weighed down by a stone. I didn't want to touch it, but I forced myself. My hands shook as I unfolded it. There were only 2 words written in jagged pencil strokes. Not yours. I stared at it until my stomach turned. My mouth felt dry, my skin cold. Someone was claiming the cabin. Someone who had been close enough to know when I left, close enough to come inside, close enough to leave me a message. I stuffed everything back into my pack as fast as I could and left. I didn't care about the food I left behind. I just wanted to get to the car. The trail felt endless. Every step I expected to hear someone following behind me. Every time the wind shifted in the trees, I spun around. When I finally reached the clearing, my car was sitting there. Relief rushed through me until I saw the driver's door. It was open. I knew I had locked it. I dropped the pack and sprinted the last few steps. The inside of the car smelled faintly of sweat and dirt. On the passenger seat was another piece of paper. This one said, "Too late." My chest locked up. I looked around, scanning the tree line. The woods were silent. Too silent. I slammed the door shut, turned the key, and drove as fast as the dirt road would let me, the car rattling over rocks and roots. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the wheel. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. Even then, I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone sitting in the back seat. That night at home, I barely slept. Every creak of the house made me jump. I kept thinking about the notes, about the footprints, about the sleeping bag spread out like someone had been lying in it. The worst part wasn't what happened there. The worst part was not knowing who it was, how long they had been watching, or if they had followed me. I never went back to that cabin. I told myself I wouldn't go out into the woods alone again. But sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I still feel it. That sense of someone moving slowly outside, close enough to hear my breath, close enough to listen, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. I had been looking forward to a quiet weekend away from everything. Away from my phone, away from work, away from people. I rented a small wooden cabin deep in the woods. A place I found listed on a forum where people shared remote spots for hunters, hikers, and campers. The photos looked simple but nice. A single-room cabin, no electricity, no running water. Just a roof, a wood stove, and an outhouse a little way behind it. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed the basics: canned food, a sleeping bag, a small propane stove, a lantern, and a backpack of supplies. I arrived late in the afternoon, parking my car at a clearing where the dirt road ended, then carrying my stuff the half-mile down the trail to the cabin. The air smelled heavy with pine, and the ground was soft with layers of needles and damp leaves. It was quiet except for the occasional rustle of birds or squirrels. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked even smaller than the photos had shown. The roof sagged a little in the middle. The wood was weathered and dark, and the single window was streaked with dirt. But it was standing and the door was sturdy. Inside, the floor was bare wood with a few patches of rot near the corners, but it was dry. There was an old iron stove in one corner, a small table, and a bunk built into the wall with a thin mattress that smelled faintly of mildew. I didn't care about the smell. I was just glad to be there. I set up my sleeping bag, put my food on the table, and lit the lantern as the sun sank lower. The woods grew darker quickly. I cooked a can of soup on my little stove, listening to the bubbling water outside the cabin where a small creek flowed past. As night fell, the silence grew heavier. I noticed how little sound carried here. In the city, there's always something in the background. Cars, voices, hums of machines. Here, once the sun dipped, there was only the creak of wood, the whisper of wind, and the occasional call of an owl. I lay in my sleeping bag and listened to the stove ticking as it cooled. The silence felt almost too big, like I was wrapped in it. At some point, I drifted into sleep. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of something snapping outside. A dry stick breaking. My eyes opened fast. I lay still, breathing shallow. The cabin was pitch black. My lantern had burned out. I listened hard, at first nothing. Then another sound. A slow crunch of weight on leaves. My body tensed. It could have been a deer. Maybe a raccoon. That's what I told myself. But something about the rhythm of the steps made me think it wasn't an animal. It was too slow, too heavy, too careful. The steps moved past the cabin, close enough that I felt I could almost sense the ground shifting. Then they stopped. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The silence stretched long. I pictured someone standing right outside, listening the way I was listening. Minutes crawled by before the steps started again, fading into the woods behind the cabin. I didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, I tried to push the thought aside. The woods are full of animals. Sound carries strangely at night. It could have been anything. I boiled water for coffee and ate a granola bar, then walked down to the creek to splash cold water on my face. The woods in daylight were calm, almost harmless. Sunlight broke through the trees, insects buzzed, and birds moved through the branches. I told myself it was fine. But when I walked back toward the cabin, I noticed something in the dirt, a footprint. It wasn't clear, but I could see the outline of a boot heel pressed into the soft ground near the corner of the cabin. I froze, staring at it. My chest felt tight. I didn't make that print. I walked around the cabin slowly, checking the ground. I saw another faint print near the back wall, then another heading toward the outhouse. Someone had been here. I stood there for a long time, looking at the trees, feeling exposed in the open daylight. Whoever it was could be watching me even now. I wanted to leave, but I told myself maybe it was an old print, maybe from a hunter who passed through. Maybe it was nothing. I tried to stick to my plan. I hiked a few miles, followed the creek, ate lunch on a rock by the water. But the whole time I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like someone was following at a distance. When I got back to the cabin that evening, I noticed the door was slightly open. My stomach dropped. I knew I had shut it in the morning. I remembered the latch clicking. I stepped closer, heart racing. I pushed the door open slowly. The room was still. My bag was where I left it. The lantern was on the table, but I saw right away that my sleeping bag had been moved. It was unrolled now, spread across the bunk as if someone had laid down in it. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring at it. The woods around me felt too quiet. I backed out slowly and shut the door. I didn't know what to do. My car was half a mile away. If someone was watching, they could follow me before I made it. If I stayed, they might come back. The light was fading fast. I decided to wait until morning. I dragged my pack outside and carried it deeper into the trees, away from the cabin. I found a spot near a thick cluster of pines where I couldn't be seen easily. I sat against the trunk, clutching the hatchet I had brought for cutting kindling. I barely slept, jerking awake at every sound. At one point in the night, I thought I heard footsteps again, moving near the cabin. A faint thump, then the sound of the cabin door opening. I couldn't see it from where I sat, but I felt certain someone was inside. I stayed still, gripping the hatchet until my hand cramped. Hours passed before dawn light crept into the trees. When I finally walked back, the cabin door was wide open. Inside, the bunk was empty, but on the table was something that hadn't been there before. A small piece of folded paper weighed down by a stone. I didn't want to touch it, but I forced myself. My hand shook as I unfolded it. There were only 2 words written in jagged pencil strokes. Not yours. I stared at it until my stomach turned. My mouth felt dry, my skin cold. Someone was claiming the cabin. Someone who had been close enough to know when I left. Close enough to come inside, close enough to leave me a message. I stuffed everything back into my pack as fast as I could and left. I didn't care about the food I left behind. I just wanted to get to the car. The trail felt endless. Every step I expected to hear someone following behind me. Every time the wind shifted in the trees, I spun around. When I finally reached the clearing, my car was sitting there. Relief rushed through me until I saw the driver's door. It was open. I knew I had locked it. I dropped the pack and sprinted the last few steps. The inside of the car smelled faintly of sweat and dirt. On the passenger seat was another piece of paper. This one said, "Too late." My chest locked up. I looked around, scanning the tree line. The woods were silent, too silent. I slammed the door shut, turned the key, and drove as fast as the dirt road would let me, the car rattling over rocks and roots. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the wheel. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. Even then, I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone sitting in the back seat. That night at home, I barely slept. Every creak of the house made me jump. I kept thinking about the notes, about the footprints, about the sleeping bag spread out like someone had been lying in it. The worst part wasn't what happened there. The worst part was not knowing who it was, how long they had been watching, or if they had followed me. I never went back to that cabin. I told myself I wouldn't go out into the woods alone again. But sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I still feel it. That sense of someone moving slowly outside, close enough to hear my breath, close enough to listen, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. I remember the cabin because it felt like it didn't belong where it was. I had been looking for a place to escape the noise of the city for a while, somewhere quiet, somewhere I could spend a week without being bothered. I found the listing online, tucked between a bunch of short-term rentals that looked too polished, too modern. This one looked old, plain, almost forgotten. The pictures showed a single-room wooden cabin sitting in the middle of tall pines with a dirt track running to it. No neighbors, no nearby houses, no paved roads. The listing made it sound like a place built decades ago and left untouched except for basic upkeep. That was exactly what I wanted. I booked it without thinking too much. The drive there took most of a day. The highway faded into narrow rural roads, and then those roads turned into a gravel path that seemed to go nowhere. I stopped twice to check my phone for directions, but the signal had cut out. I had downloaded the map offline, which helped me keep track, but I could feel how far I was from other people. Each turn of the wheels kicked up clouds of dust that hung in the air behind me. The trees grew thicker on both sides, the kind of forest that blocked out most of the sunlight once you were inside. It was quiet in a way that didn't feel natural. No cars, no houses, no signs of people, just endless trees. I finally reached the cabin in the early evening. It sat in a small clearing where the dirt track ended. The structure was simple, weathered wood with a tin roof, a front porch with a railing that sagged on one side, and one small window near the door. Behind it stretched more trees, darker and denser than the ones I had driven through. It looked exactly like the pictures, maybe even older. I turned off the engine and sat in the car for a moment, listening to the silence. It felt like the air itself was heavy. No birds, no insects, no sound of wind, just stillness. I unloaded my gear, sleeping bag, food, a few bottles of water, a lantern, and a bag of clothes. Inside the cabin was one large room with a wood stove against the far wall, a narrow cot with a thin mattress, and a table with 2 chairs. Dust covered everything, and the air smelled faintly of damp wood. I opened the single window to let some air in, but the forest outside pressed against the frame like a wall. I set my things down, lit the lantern as the light faded, and tried to settle in. That first night I told myself the silence was peaceful, but it wasn't. It was the kind of silence where your ears strain to hear something, anything, until even the smallest noise makes you jump. I lay on the cot staring at the roof, hearing my own breathing too loud in the stillness. Every creak of the cabin's wood made me tense up. At one point I thought I heard a branch snap outside. I told myself it was just an animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't empty. The next day I tried to distract myself. I walked around the clearing, explored the dirt track for a while, and tried to take in the scenery. The woods were thick, the ground uneven with rocks and roots, and the canopy above blocked out most of the sun. I didn't go far. Every step deeper into the trees felt wrong, like the forest didn't want me there. The air inside was cooler, but it smelled of rot, damp earth, and old leaves. The deeper I looked, the less I saw. The trees closed in like walls, and the shadows looked darker than they should have been. I walked back quickly, telling myself it was just unfamiliar land. That afternoon, I noticed something odd near the edge of the clearing. A tree about 20 feet from the cabin had deep gouges carved into its bark. They weren't the kind of marks an animal would make. They were straight lines, long and even, as if made with a knife or hatchet. 4 of them cut low into the trunk. I crouched down, touching the grooves, and the wood was fresh, the shavings still clinging. Someone had made them not long ago. That unsettled me. There were supposed to be no other cabins nearby. The listing had said this place was isolated, with no neighbors for miles. I told myself maybe it was old damage, but the cuts looked too clean. That night I slept poorly again. I woke several times, convinced I heard something outside. Once I thought I heard footsteps in the clearing, slow and deliberate, moving across the dry leaves. When I sat up, holding my breath, the sound stopped. I waited in the dark, clutching the lantern, staring at the door. My heartbeat filled my ears. Eventually, I told myself it was nothing and lay back down, but I didn't sleep for a long time. The third day, I noticed more. Another tree near the back of the clearing had markings. Not cuts this time, but what looked like a small symbol scratched into the bark, a crude X shape. I stood staring at it, trying to convince myself it was coincidence. Maybe kids had come through at some point. Maybe hunters used marks like that. But I hadn't seen a single person since I'd arrived. Not even on the road coming in. And the scratches looked new. The unease built steadily. I stopped walking into the forest and kept close to the cabin. I ate my food in silence, sitting at the table, listening for noises outside. I checked the window often, scanning the trees, half expecting to see someone watching. But there was never anyone there. Just trees. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night the sound returned, clearer than before. Footsteps. This time I was sure of it. They moved around the cabin slowly, circling. The dry crunch of leaves and twigs breaking under weight. I sat up on the cot, gripping the lantern with both hands, heart pounding. The steps would pause, then start again, as if someone was stopping to listen. I thought about calling out, but the idea of making a sound felt wrong, like it would invite something closer. Instead, I stayed silent, straining to hear. After what felt like an hour, the steps faded into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I stepped outside cautiously. The clearing looked the same, but when I walked around the cabin, I saw footprints in the dirt near the back wall. They weren't animal prints. They were shoe prints. Someone had been there. The sight made my stomach sink. The nearest town was hours away. No one had any reason to be out here, and whoever it was had come during the night, walking right up to the cabin. I thought about leaving then. I even packed my bag, loading my things back into the car. But when I turned the key, the engine wouldn't start. It made a weak clicking sound, then nothing. I tried again and again, but it was dead. I checked under the hood, even though I knew nothing about engines. I couldn't find anything obvious. The car had worked fine the whole trip up. Now it wouldn't even turn over. My chest tightened with panic. Without it, I was stranded. No signal on my phone, no neighbors, no help. Just me in the cabin in the woods. That night, the sounds came earlier. I sat at the table with the lantern burning low, trying to read a book to distract myself, when I heard the first crunch of footsteps. They moved slowly around the clearing again, closer this time, brushing against the porch. My skin crawled. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The steps moved to the side of the cabin, pausing near the window. I didn't dare look. I pictured someone standing right there, inches from the glass, staring in. My pulse hammered in my ears. After a long time, the steps retreated into the woods again. In the morning, I found more footprints, clearer now in the soft earth near the porch. Large prints, deeper than mine, like the person was heavier. I also noticed something that made my stomach twist. Near the tree line, just at the edge of the clearing, there was a small pile of rocks stacked carefully on top of one another. 4 of them, balanced neatly. I hadn't seen them before. Someone had made them recently. I knocked the pile over, angry and scared, but by the next morning another pile had appeared in a different spot. This continued each day. Small piles of rocks, always in view of the cabin, always new. The days blurred together. I barely slept. I ate little. My body ached from the tension. I tried walking back down the dirt track, hoping maybe I could reach a road. But after an hour of walking, I realized it twisted endlessly through the trees. And without cell service, I had no way to know how far the main road was. Panic rose in me and I turned back. The cabin was the only thing I knew in those woods, and even though it felt unsafe, leaving it felt worse. The harassment escalated. One night I woke to the sound of something scraping against the door. A slow, deliberate drag of metal or stone against wood. I froze, clutching the lantern, staring at the dark outline of the door. The sound lasted several minutes, then stopped. When I checked in the morning, I saw fresh scratches across the lower half of the door. Long gouges cutting deep into the wood. My chest tightened as I traced them with my fingers. Someone was trying to break in, or scare me, or both. By the fifth night, I was unraveling. I hadn't slept more than a couple of hours at a time. My hands shook constantly. I started barricading the door with the table and chairs each night, pushing the cot against it too. I sat awake with the lantern until it burned low, listening. Every sound outside made me flinch. Sometimes I thought I heard breathing just beyond the walls. Sometimes I thought I heard whispering, though I knew that was impossible. My mind was breaking under the stress. The sixth night was the worst. The noises came earlier than ever and louder. Fee,